Hi, and welcome again to Jacob's Ladder. I just wanted to make this short video to answer a question that kind of got me thinking. After putting out that last video, I realized that probably there are going to be people wondering why I'm not Catholic or Orthodox. And in fact, I've received that question in the comments of my videos before. And I feel like this is probably as good a time as any to address the answer as to why I'm Anglican and why I'm not Catholic or Orthodox in a sort of short form fashion, just because, I know the views that I espoused in that video are probably going to sound very Catholic to Protestants and not Catholic enough to some Catholics. Or it'll sound Catholic enough that they're basically like, why don't you just cross the Tiber? And there's reasons. So I'll kind of just lay those out, and you can do with that what you will, but at least it'll give you some kind of answer. And if you are really mad about what I say, feel free to tell me that in the comments, and I may or may not actually respond to it. It depends on whether or not I want to punch myself over and over again. But essentially what happened is I became Anglican because that was the first form of apostolic Christianity that I was introduced to. I was introduced to it by my then friend, later girlfriend, and now wife, who took me to my first Eucharistic service on a Sunday at the church that I now currently attend in the Reformed Episcopal Church. We later attended a Episcopal church together and tried to do reforms in that with the whole Reconquista movement that Redeemed Zoomer was part of. But what really drew me in hardcore was the liturgy, and specifically the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, B, the Book of Common Prayer. I think the Book of Common Prayer, in most forms that it exists in, is basically the best little combo liturgy for Sunday plus, the Book of Hours equivalent that a person can have in order to establish really strong prayerful practices in a person's life on every day of the week. That's why I did a whole video where I talked about, how to use the Book of Common Prayer for morning and evening prayer. It's because I think that just made my prayer life explode out of proportion compared to what it was before. It really, really reinvigorated my faith. And it's unique to Anglicanism. Now, I know that the Ordinariates have that, or something like it, with their Divine Worship book. And it is roughly the same as like a 1979 Rite 1 Rite. That being said, it still is primarily from the Anglican churches, from whether you're an Anglo-Catholic or a more evangelical Anglican. The prayer book, I think, is just really unique, and most versions of it are very good for personal devotion. I also think that when I started getting into the Church Fathers, I started seeing very much that, the episcopate seems to be present earlier than a lot of people would like to admit, and that for the majority of Christian history, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist was basically the only interpretation of the Eucharist. And then furthermore, I became convinced of things like infant baptism. The more that I learned, I became convinced of, the importance of tradition. I learned a lot from reading through the Church Fathers and then reading commentary. I had for a long time, actually, a study Bible. It's the CSB Ancient Faith Study Bible. And I still think it's a really good study Bible, even though I've actually got a new study Bible coming on the way. That is the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible. But that study Bible is fantastic because all of the commentary is like first millennium Church Fathers and patristics. And it is so cool, and it's really well referenced and really well structured. It's beautifully designed. And reading through the Bible with that kind of patristic lens in place, I started to just really, really appreciate apostolic Christianity, historic Christianity, and then the liturgy just transformed me. It really made me a better Christian, I think. I mean, I'm not perfect by any means. I'm the last person to say that I'm perfect. But it really did give me a new sense of devotion. Now, the further I got into it, the more I had to confront the claims of the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. And the reason why I don't ascribe to those is, well, I'll start with the Orthodox because I think that one's a little easier and also more vague. With the Eastern Orthodox, I love a lot of their practices and a lot of their liturgies. I really respect them. I don't really have a problem with icon veneration, even though I don't personally venerate icons. But I do like the Eastern Orthodox's history. I like a lot of their current scholars and writers. I like, a lot of the Lord of Spirits type crowd. I've enjoyed that stuff. But despite that, the Eastern Orthodox mysticism I really like. But I think mysticism needs to be combined with scholasticism. And what I find in modern Eastern Orthodoxy is that, for one, they tend to attribute anything that they don't like to the West. And I feel like it comes off very condemnatory of anything Western as being like, I don't know, a product of the Enlightenment. And I don't really like that because I actually feel like I tend to be a more systematic person. And so when I look at the scholasticism of, say, like St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine and these people, whereas, the patristics really dive more into people like Gregory and Maximus the Confessor, who I think are still great. But if you do it at the detriment of really diving into some of the more scholastic saints, I think that you get kind of a half-baked theology that's very unsystematic and is not always consistent. And I think that the Eastern Orthodox tries to say that they are super consistent in everything they do, and that they've been consistent across time. I don't think that's true. I think one of the big places in which that's not true is their position as relates to people that are not members of the Eastern Orthodox churches, which is that historically they did not believe those people were saved, and they did not believe they were Christians. They have since kind of flip-flopped on that and then tried to backpedal their argumentation to say that it always was that way. I don't believe that's true, and I don't agree with that stance. And I just, there's claims that they make that don't work for me. I don't fully understand their structure. It just doesn't work as well for me. Now, that's to say that between the two, I find the Catholic arguments more convincing. I don't agree with them all, but I do find them more convincing. Between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, I would be more drawn to Roman Catholicism than Eastern Orthodoxy. But I still have real reasons that I'm not Roman Catholic. The biggest one would be, to me, papal authority and fallibility. My reading of history is such that I don't believe that the Pope was always considered ruling over the other churches to the degree that he is now. I believe First Among Equals was definitely, the original view, but that the level to which the authority of the Pope expanded is not really what was intended from the outset. We have a very radically expanded papacy now in the ability to make papal statements and define dogmas. And I have an issue with that because, and I could get more into this in a different video or if I had a dialogue with somebody, I suppose, but the bottom line is this. I think that the papal statements that are defined in Vatican I basically rely on Vatican I in order to, the statement that is made in Vatican I, where Vatican I is declaring infallibly that the Pope can infallibly declare things, is basically self-reliant. It's circular logic. I don't believe that the early church believed that the Pope of Rome was... I don't believe that the early church believed that the Bishop of Rome had the ability to announce that he was going to infallibly rule on doctrine. It seems to me that the ecumenical councils where everybody came together were for that purpose. And the Bishop of Rome had clearly less power than he does now. And they'll point to bits of text in the patristics that point to these things, but what I generally find is that a lot of the stuff that points to it, that the Roman Catholic arguments will use, it does rely on a lot of interpretation to get there, and it is just not clearly stated until much later. And because of that, I have issues with some of the other doctrines that they've come up with since then. I don't have an issue with like the perpetual virginity of Mary, or even the Assumption of Mary, for instance. But I have really big problems with their view of the Immaculate Conception. I think that the Immaculate Conception primarily emerges as a theological proof by which the Church thinks that that's how Mary is preserved. That's how Jesus is preserved from original sin, that Mary has to be preserved from it in order for Christ to be. I don't agree with that. I think that the sanctifying power of the Holy Spirit, when it comes upon her, removes her original sin, and that original sin is therefore not transferred to Christ when he is born of her. Like, I still believe that she lost original sin. I don't believe it was at the moment of her conception. I believe that it worked in a similar way to like baptism, but like a much more preeminent and grace-filled baptism that is unique to Mary. Like, we're still talking about something unique to Mary, but I don't believe that she was conceived free of original sin, and I also don't believe that there's a strong argument to be made that I don't think there's a strong argument to be made that she lived a completely sinless life. And while you can point to certain church fathers that say that's the case, you could also point to certain church fathers that say, in no uncertain terms, that the Eucharist might have been more symbolic, and like Tertullian. And I don't think that that's a good reason to believe Tertullian on that. I think that the doctrine of Christ's sinlessness in the New Testament and in the early church, the very early church, I think it leans toward an interpretation that Christ was unique in his sinlessness, and I therefore don't find the Marian dogma of the Immaculate Conception worth clarifying and quantifying in that way. Most importantly, though, I don't think that any of the Marian dogmas are to the level of importance that they severely damage Christology if you do not hold to them. And therefore, I don't think that the church should be able to infallibly rule that you must believe those dogmas in order to be a member of the true faithful. I think that that is kind of jumping the gun and getting ahead of yourself. And I don't feel comfortable with those. So I would never feel like I could become a catechist of the Roman Catholic Church, because I don't believe that that's right, and I don't believe that you should be able to make people assent to those things if they don't, in order for them to be a member of the church. And there's other stuff I could talk about. I mean, I don't really like the way that they deal with the sacrament of confession and penance. I feel like that's kind of abused sometimes, where the penance is basically not real spiritual direction, and where you basically can't be forgiven if you don't have confession with a priest for mortal sins. It seems to me like they do a lot of stuff where they get in the way of people being able to go to Christ themselves post-resurrection. And I don't know, there's just some weird stuff like that bothers me. And that's why I'm Anglican, is because I see it as that via media between Catholicism and Protestantism. What I want to be a member of the Reformed Catholic Christianity. And what that means is I'm in the Protestant denomination that gets me as close to Catholicity as is within reason. And anything past that, I think, is stepping over a line that is not worth stepping over. And so that's why I'm Anglican. I'm Anglican because this is the closest to Catholicism that I can get without voiding my conscience. And until such a time as, we come to a better agreement about like a shared terminology and understanding of what matters to believe in the faith, or until such a time as Rome reforms themselves I will continue to remain Anglican, and I will encourage those that feel this way, as I do, to join the Anglican churches and to represent that bridge towards unity, because I think that could be the bridge towards unity. Like, we're people that desperately want to be Catholic Christians. There's just some stuff in the way that we need to work through, and I think, with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, God willing, someday those things will get worked through. So that's my thoughts on that. See you in the next one.